Welcome on behalf of the Glasgow Endowment Committee, which I have the privilege of serving without serving on, which is kind of nice. I want, before I introduce Rebecca, to tell those of you who didn't notice that there is an entire pyramid of her books outside here. I think about 3 each will do it. She'll be glad to sign them for you. While you take advantage of the refreshments that have been so nicely set up for us. You probably already know that Rebecca Makkai is a Washington Lee graduate who worked for Shenandoah for 3 years. And I'm guessing that you've heard about her terrific publication record besides Shenandoah. She's had work in the Iowa Review, Tin House, New England Review, Plowshares, Crazy Horse, and amazingly, the last 4 editions of the Best American Short Stories comes out every year. She's keeping other people from getting in there. Her novel, The Borrower, published this year by Viking, has been named to Booklist's annual 10 breakout novels list. And she's well into a second novel and in the process of stitching together her stories for a collection. Rebecca also graduated from Middlebury College's Breadloaf School of English, where she studied some with David Huddle, whom I'd like to see us have here soon too. She said in an interview that her influences run from Rousseau to Rushdie, and from Borges to the Brontes, though not all of the Brontes, Calvino, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So it's not surprising that her work has also been anthologized in Best American Fantasy Stories. Rebecca does not write romances, though her stories are filled with love. She does not write thrillers, though the language of her stories is thrilling. She doesn't write travel literature, but one sees both foreign and domestic places vividly in her work. She does not write mysteries, but she's always writing about the big mystery. Rebecca Makkai.
Thank you. That's very nice. I found that my novel is alarmingly unexcerptable, and for that reason, I'm not going to read one chunk, but several. And I'll explain to you in between what's going on so that you can follow a bit of the plot. And it's all towards the beginning. I'm not giving too much away. The prologue of this book is actually quite different from the rest of the book, but the prologue is called Ian Was Never Happy Unless There Was a Prologue. I might be the villain of this story. Even now it's hard to tell. Back at the library, amid the books and books on ancient Egypt, the picture the children loved most showed the god of death weighing a dead man's heart against a feather. There is this consolation then, at least. One day I will know my guilt. I've left behind everyone I used to know. I've found another library, a college library, where the borrowers already know what they're looking for. I scan their books, and they barely acknowledge me through their caffeinated haze. It's nothing like my old stained carpet, brick-walled library, but the books are the same. Same spines, same codes on yellowed labels. I know what's in them all. They whisper their judgment down. The runaways, the kidnappers, look down from their shelves and claim me for their own. They tell me to light out for the territory, reckon I'm headed for hell just like them. They say I'm the most terrific liar they ever saw in their lives. And that one, old lecher lepidopterist, gabbling grabber, stirring his vodka pineapple from the high, narrow shelf of NAB, let me twist his words. You can always count on a librarian for a derivative prose style. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, exhibit number 1 is what I envied, what I thought I could fix. Look at this prison of books. Before this all began, I told Rocky that one day I'd arrange my books by main character, down through the alphabet. I realize now where I'd be, Hull, snug between Huck and Humbert. But really I should file it under Drake, for Ian, for the boy I stole. Because regardless of who the villain is, I'm not the hero of this story. I'm not even the subject of this prayer. And chapter 1, which I'll read just the first part of, is called Story Hour. Every Friday at 4:30, they gathered cross-legged on the brown shag rug, picked at its crust of mud and glitter and Elmer's glue, and leaned against the picture book shelves. I had 5 regulars, and a couple would have come 7 days a week if they could. Ian Drake came with chicken pox and with a broken leg. He came even when he knew it had been canceled that week, and sat there reading aloud to himself. And then each week there were 2 or 3 extras whose parents happened to need a babysitter. They'd squirm through chapters 8 and 9 of a book they couldn't follow, pulling strings from their socks and then flossing their teeth with them. That fall, 5 years ago, we were halfway through Matilda. Ian came galloping up to me before reading time, our 4th week into the book. I told my mom we're reading Little House in the Big Woods again. I don't think she'd be a fan of Matilda too much. She didn't even like Fantastic Mr. Fox. He forked his fingers through his hair. Are we capiche? I nodded. We don't want your mom to worry. We hadn't gotten to the magic part yet, but Ian had read it before, secretly, crouched on the floor by the Roald Dahl shelf. He knew what was coming. He skipped off down the biography aisle, then wandered back up through science, his head tilted sideways to read the spines. Lorraine came up beside me, Lorraine Best, the head librarian, and watched the first few children gather on the rug. She came downstairs some Fridays just to smile and nod at the mothers as they dropped them off, as if she had some hand in chapter book hour, as if her reading 3 minutes of Green Eggs and Ham wouldn't make half the children cry and the others raise their hands to ask if she was a good witch or a bad witch. Ian disappeared again, then walked up through American history, touching each book in the top right-hand row. He practically lives here, doesn't he? Lorraine whispered. That little homosexual boy. He's 10 years old, I said. I doubt he's anything sexual. Well, I'm sorry, Lucy. I have nothing against him, but that child is a gay. She said it with the same tone of pleasure at her own imagined magnanimity that my father used every time he referred to Ophelia, my black secretary. Over in fiction now, Ian stood on tiptoes to pull a large green book from a high shelf. A mystery. The blue sticker man with his magnifying glass peered from the spine. Ian sat on the floor and started in on the first page, as if it indeed contained all the mysteries of the world, as if everything in the universe could be solved by page 132. His glasses caught the fluorescent light, 2 yellow discs over the pages. He didn't move until the other children began gathering, and Lorraine bent down beside him and said, "Everyone's waiting for you." We weren't. Tony didn't even have his coat off yet, but Ian scooted on his rear all the way across the floor to join us, without ever looking up from the book. We had 5 listeners that day, all regulars. "All right," I said, hoping Lorraine would make her exit now. "Where did we leave off?" "Miss Trunchbull yelled because they didn't know their math," said Melissa. "And she yelled at Miss Honey, and they were learning their 3s. Ian sighed loudly and held up his hand. "Yes?" "That was all 2 weeks ago, but when last we left our heroine, she was learning of Miss Trunchbull's history as a hammer thrower, and also we were learning of the many torture devices she kept in her office." "Thank you, Ian." He grinned at me. Lorraine rolled her eyes, whether at me or Ian, I wasn't sure, and tottered back to the stairs. I almost always had to cut Ian off, but he didn't mind. Short of burning down the library, there was nothing I could do that would push him away. I was keeping Tales of a 4th grade nothing behind the desk to sneak him whenever he came without his babysitter. Almost every afternoon for the past week, he had run downstairs and stuck his head over my desk, panting. Back then, before that long winter, Ian reminded me most of a helium balloon. Not just his voice, but the way he'd look straight up when he talked and bounced around on his toes as if he were struggling not to take off. "Did he have a predecessor?" asks Humbert. No, he didn't. I'd never met anyone like him in my life. Whenever he couldn't find a book he liked, he'd come lean on the desk. "What should I read?" "How to Stop Whining," I'd say, or "An Introduction to the Computer Catalog." But he knew I was kidding. He knew it was my favorite question in the world. Then I'd pick something for him. D'Aulaire's Greek Myths one time, The Wheel on the School another. He usually liked what I picked, and the D'Aulaire's launched him on a mythology spree that lasted a good 2 months. Because Lorraine warned me early on about Ian's mother, I made sure he read books with innocuous titles and pleasant covers, nothing scary looking, no Egypt game. When he was 8, he came with a babysitter and borrowed theater shoes. He returned it the next day and told me he was only allowed to read boy books. Fortunately, his mother didn't seem to have a great knowledge of children's literature. My Side of the Mountain crept under the radar, and From the Mixed-Up Files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler. Both books about running away, I realized later, though I swear at the time it never crossed my mind. We finished 2 chapters, and then I stalled until 5:30, when half the mothers would bounce down the stairs in their tennis skirts, and the other half would emerge with their toddlers from the picture book pit. Who is the hero of this book? I asked. This was easy. It was always the main character. In children's books, there is rarely an anti-hero, an unreliable narrator. Aaron sounded like he'd been practicing his answer for days. Matilda is really the hero, but Miss Honey is kind of the hero too because she's very nice. Who's the villain? Mrs. Crunchable, shouted Tessa, even though she's a principal, and principals are usually nice. Yes, I said, I think you're right. Even when the bad guy isn't a man in a black mask, they have a fairly good sense of villainy. A few bright ones understand how broad the category can be. Because a villain could be anyone, like a bunny in your garden, Tessa said. Could it even be someone's parents, I asked. I wanted them to think about Matilda's wretched TV-addicted mother and father, the book's other antagonists. Yeah, said Tony, like if your mom has a gun. These were wise, modern children, and they knew. A mother could be a witch, a child could be a criminal, a librarian could be a thief. And I'm skipping ahead a bit, although I'll give you a little bit of explanation. What's happened at this point is that Ian's mother has come downstairs in the library one day, upset about a book that her son has taken home. And she presents a list to Lucy, who's our narrator, I'm not sure if her name has come up yet, with the types of books that Ian is not allowed to borrow. She's decided she needs to spell it out for her. And it includes books about magic, which, if you know anything about children's literature, rules out most everything. She doesn't want him to read Harry Potter, who she actually thinks is an author, and the list goes on from there. Now, if you know anything about our Constitution or our public library system, it's actually illegal to deny access of a book to a patron within reason. So there's nothing that she can do to comply with this list, in addition to which she actually doesn't want to. But she just nods and sort of plays along. Ian has only been coming now with supervision to the library. He used to come every day. His visits have gotten more infrequent from this point on. And so I'm skipping ahead to chapter 4, which is a short chapter. It's called The Ark. I had to give him credit. Ian was brilliant. He came one day in November with his babysitter, after several weeks of chaperoned checkouts, in which he had half-heartedly borrowed various biographies and a collection of Native American myths and legends. They're all about crows, he said when he returned it. My review is that this book is a little too crow-heavy. The babysitter, Sonia, was a bedraggled Filipino woman with her own 5-year-old daughter, who sometimes silently accompanied them and then sat in the corner stroking the puppets. When Ian picked out chapter books, Sonia would flip them over in her hands, flick through the pages as if their appropriateness would thereby reveal itself, and then ask, "What your mother is going to say. I will show her this, okay?" Ian would invariably grab the book, shove it back on the shelf, and storm off to nonfiction. That Saturday in November, he and Sonia came in without the 5-year-old, and Ian immediately sat down at one of the computers opposite my desk, something he never did, not even to look up a book. He said, "Hey, Sonia, I'm going to play Noah's Mission online. Want to watch?" "Your mom say no video games at the library." Ian's voice became so shrill that I knew she'd agree to whatever he said just to get him to stop. It was a voice like pepper spray. "This is the one game I'm allowed to play, and you've seen me play it at home. It's the one with Noah. You can ask her. You can call her right now and ask her, but she'll be really mad at you for calling because she's in the middle of her meeting, but you can call anyway." Sonia said, okay, and settled into the chair beside his. It was the most inane and slow-paced computer game I'd ever seen, with graphics out of 1988. Noah had to run around collecting 2 of every animal, carrying them on his head back to the ark. Meanwhile, coconuts fell on him, and eagles swooped down to carry off his loot. I had to cough to keep from laughing out loud when Noah died and fell off the bottom of the screen, while the computer beeped away in a suddenly minor key. It normally drove me crazy when kids came in just to play games, but this one was perversely entertaining, if only for its awfulness, and I was secretly thrilled to see that Noah had 9 more available lives. Sonia must have seen it too, because this was the point when she announced that she was heading upstairs to get a magazine. Ian stared closely at the computer screen, balancing a goat on Noah's head, until Sonia had rounded the corner. Then he spun out of his chair and ran to my desk. "Mission accomplished! Wasn't that awesome? I bored her to death." He took off the empty backpack that I realized just now he'd been wearing the whole time, and unzipped it. "Fill her up." I felt like I was on that old game show where you had 3 minutes to race around the supermarket, finding all the things on your list. I practically trampled a roaming toddler to get at A Wrinkle in Time, and then I grabbed the Westing game, and Haroon and the Sea of Stories, and 5 Children and It. He followed me, holding the backpack open while I dumped things in. It was starting to look full, and I didn't want Sonia to be suspicious, but I couldn't resist adding The Princess Bride. I didn't know how long this load would have to last him. He zipped up and raced back to the computer, where Noah was still standing dumbly, goat on his head, unmarred by coconut or eagle. I went back to my own computer to enter all the books manually and check them out to my own account. I couldn't be sure that Lorraine wouldn't gladly rattle off Ian's list of checked-out books to his mother. Sonia returned just a minute later, the latest John Grisham tucked under her arm. "God is flooding the world yet?" "No, this game is stupid. Let's go." "You don't want to check out some books?" "I'm just not that into reading anymore." In a library in Missouri that was covered with vines lived thousands of books in 100 straight lines. A boy came in at 9:30 every Saturday, rain or shine. His book selections were clandestine. And, okay, so skipping forward a lot, it's really funny because I could tell that the girls, like the college-age girls, knew what that was, and the college-age boys had no idea what that just was. So I'm skipping ahead, and basically what's happened at this point is that although Lucy was happy to kind of sneak him these books, things got a little more sinister at, around Christmas time. She is given a gift from Ian of a piece of origami that she keeps on her desk for a few weeks. And when she goes to unfold it to throw it away, she discovers that it's actually a folded up email, or part of one, and gathers from the email, she's not sure whether he brought it to her on purpose or not, but gathers from the email that his parents have enrolled him in what is euphemistically termed reparative therapy. When I started my book tour in June, no one had really heard of this, and by the end of the summer, Michelle Bachman's husband had put a national spotlight on what that is. It is the organizations that purport to de-gayify adults, or in some cases adolescents, or even children. And his parents, like most of the other people in the community, unlike Lucy, but like her boss, are kind of looking at him thinking, it's probably a child who'll grow up gay. His parents are sort of on the, let's just say, the unpleasant end of fundamentalism, and think that this is the solution for their child. So that winter, she's tries to be objective in the way that she observes this boy, but starts to see him really fall apart. Whether from this or from other sort of sinister things about his home life that she's starting to notice, she's not sure. But she does know that he's very unhappy. So I'm going to, actually, it's kind of funny, but I'm going to read you the very end of chapter 12, and then I'll read you chapter 13. So, the end of chapter 12. This is where the story should end. And sometimes, sitting here, pressing the top of my knee against the bottom of the table, listening to the shallow keystrokes of the graduate students at their laptops, waiting for the sun to sink into the window frame and blind me with red light. Sometimes I think this is where it ended, that everything that followed was a dream. That maybe I'm looking back now, imagining what might have happened if only I had done something, when really I did nothing. When I spent the next 5 years sitting peacefully in Hannibal, watching Ian turn 11 and then 12, then realizing he hadn't been in to see me for a while, then seeing him only a couple of times a year as I drove past him on the sidewalk and wondered how his life was going, not wanting to embarrass him by rolling down my window and calling out. But no, it did happen. The only thing up for debate is whether it happened to me or whether I made it happen. And I'll spare you the beginning of chapter 13 partly because it consists of her neighbor doing vocal warm-up exercises, and I'm not going to do that in public. Outside, a dark Midwestern storm was barreling in, the first of the year, and the growing thunder sounded something like dumpsters scraping on gravel or God chewing rocks. The wind was almost as loud as the thunder, and I wasn't always confident that my windows wouldn't crash out of their rotted frames. I thought of turning on music to go back to sleep, but couldn't bear adding to the noise level. I let myself put on old jeans and hiking boots, and spent 3 minutes scratching my back against the corner of my dresser like a psychotic cat. She's gotten this like rash from stress, this one. She's not actually that psychotic. It was only a matter of time before I really broke the skin, before someone approached me on the street to ask why the back of my shirt was soaked in blood. I headed to work early to get the summer reading flyers finished, and to see what damage Sarah Ann had done yesterday, closing up by herself. It was pouring rain by the time I got there at 7, and branches were down all over the neighborhood. I shook myself off in the lobby and wiped my feet and locked the door again behind me. I'd have 2 hours alone. Maybe because of the quiet, I was more tuned in to details that morning. Always a problem for me, since in stories and movies, a focus on little details tends to indicate imminent disaster. Someone in a movie unlocks his door, checks his mail, turns on his light, and you know he's got about 30 seconds to live. So I was irrationally filled with dread that morning, as I often was when I entered the library early and alone, and the only sounds I could hear were my fingers on paper or my purse sliding into the desk drawer. I sat in the darkness for a moment, then got up to turn on the downstairs lights, all 6 light switches, one after the other, different walls and display cases dramatically announcing themselves. I went behind my desk and sank again into the soft spinning chair, when a sound like crumpling paper came from the end of one of the fiction aisles. My stomach turned liquid and I pulled my feet up on the chair. I had only ever had one mouse in my apartment, but it bothered me so much, the idea of some little thing invading like that I'd stayed late at work every night until I was sure it was poisoned and gone. Now I banged my fist hard on the desk to scare this one away. I lowered my foot and kicked the drawers and listened for more scampering. "Miss Hull?" said Ian's voice. I was so used to him saying my name just like that I looked for him right in front of the desk and not where the sounds had come from. And then I was reminding myself not to swear as I stumbled down the aisle. Ian was squatting on the floor by the big plant stand with books and t-shirts and blankets spread around him. He was giggling. He looked terrified. He took his glasses off and wiped his eyes. "Please don't tell, please," he said. "I mean my parents or the police. I'm very, 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 very sorry." I sat beside him on the carpet, attempting a placid smile and not processing much of anything. "Okay." I waited. He was biting the knee of his jeans and rocking back and forth, but he wasn't crying, not really. "Look," he said suddenly, and way too loudly, and reached behind himself. "I made a real knapsack." He held out a long, thick twig with what looked like a balled-up flannel shirt tied to the end. "What's in here?" I felt the lumps in the shirt, and Ian untied it. He was suddenly breathing normally and smiling, leaning back against the shelf. "Number 1, dental floss." He picked it out of the pile. "Shampoo, power bars. Don't you think that's good that I brought power bars? They have pretty much every vitamin. Here's my medicine." He held up an asthma inhaler and a bottle of pills. "Toothbrush, toothpaste, pool pass, socks." Calm, normal voice. "Are you going swimming?" "No," he almost laughed. "It's my ID, in case I need one for something." "Well, that's very thorough, Ian." "Do you know why I didn't bring anything to do?" "No, I don't." "Because I was coming here. There are books and I can write things and I've been doing origami. I'm sorry I robbed the craft cupboard. Look." He reached into the plant behind him and pulled out a paper crane. All the pots were filled with folded pieces of notebook and construction paper. In the biggest one, he'd set up a village with houses and people and trees. Other pots had families and animals, small and large, and many of my plants had bright paper flowers stuck in their leaves. "Here's my plane wreck one." In one pot was a crumpled paper airplane with its nose in the dirt, surrounded by red and orange triangles. "Those are the flames." "Wow," I said, "so you must have been here a long time." He looked at his watch. 14 hours. "You slept here overnight?" Here's what I did. My parents were really busy with this Bible study thing at our house, so I just walked here. And that other lady didn't even really look around when she left, even though I was ready to hide behind all the different shelves wherever she walked. And then I got a cot from the closet in that other room, but I put it back when I woke up. I watered your plants. Thank you. So you wouldn't have to do it later and get the origami wet. I got up off the floor and brought over the rolling stool to sit on. Okay, I said. Your mom and dad have been scared for a really long time now. We're going to call them. Ian pulled a book off the shelf and held it open right in front of his face. He mumbled into it, I don't think that's so good an idea. I tried to pull the book down, but he was strong. Do you want to call them or should I? He didn't say anything, so I should do it. I was expecting a tantrum like the one I'd seen before Christmas, expecting him to throw the book down and scream, but nothing happened. I stood and walked to my desk. What's your phone number? His head appeared at the near end of the aisle, but still down by the floor. He must have crawled there. He told me the number, and I dialed. You have reached the Human Resources Department of Missouri Electric, said the phone. Our operating hours are 9 to 5:30, Monday through Friday. Ian, I said, hanging up, do you live at the power company? His face was gone from the aisle. Ian, what's your real number? I forget, he said, from right behind me. I jumped and hit my knee on the desk. I pulled the phone out and flipped to the D section. Okay, then we'll look you up. We're unlisted, he said, smiling. It was true, no Drakes and Hannibal. I flopped the book closed and watched the utter relief settle on his face. He was playing with the bottom button on his shirt, but he was holding himself together. He must have been planning this for weeks. Did he think he was going to live in the library? 14 hours was longer than the normal punish your parents runaway scenario. Well, I said, I'm happy you came to visit me, Ian, but the library opens pretty soon and you can't live in my plants. We can either call the police or I can drive you home. He turned and kicked my file cabinet once, hard, and walked toward his aisle, crying silently, his face a violent red. He came back with his coat on, carrying his knapsack. He nodded at me and then started up the stairs. I left the lights on but locked everything up and met him in the parking lot. I was surprised that he was waiting for me, that he hadn't run off. Maybe on some level I really had wanted him to make a run for it, but he was still there, standing in the rain by my little pale blue car. He wanted to go home. I got in my driver's seat and unlocked the passenger door from inside before I realized he was waiting for the back door. It hit me as it hadn't yet that he was 10, that he rode in the back seat, that he might have a nightlight. He got in and I had to dig around between the seats for the seatbelt, and I tried to remember if anyone had ever sat back there before. We started driving. I didn't ask him for his address because I didn't know the parts of town well enough, but he gave me directions, announcing each one straight into my ear over the back of my seat. Turn left at the next stop sign, he shouted. Keep going for 1 mile. Turn left and then right. Ian, I said after a while, I think you're sending me in a big circle. Really, I wasn't sure, but it was taking a long time, and I knew he walked to the library. No, he shouted, I'm not. And in fact, if you look right up here, it's going to be exactly the last house on your left. I watched along the left side until I saw a tall yellow house with perfectly conical little cedar trees along the fence. We stopped by the curb. The newspaper was still at the end of the driveway in its orange plastic, and a short old man was running from his car to the house with a magazine between his head and the rain. Ian, that's not your dad. He looked out the window. Yeah, you're right. Is this your house, though? I'm not sure. You're not sure? Well, they painted our house very recently, and it sort of looks different, so it's not familiar to me. I closed my eyes. Okay, we're going to the police station. There was complete silence in the back seat. I looked in the rearview mirror, and he wasn't there. I turned off the car and opened my door to jump out and catch him wherever he was running. But then I saw him crumpled up on the floor of the back seat, his arms up on his head like in a bomb drill. His whole body heaved with crying or vomiting. I couldn't see. He'd left his glasses and coat up on the seat. I opened the door and squatted down on the curb and put my hand on his back. His shirt was hot and wet and it stuck to him. He said something I couldn't understand. What? He lifted his head just enough to wipe his nose on his sleeve. Please, you're just supposed to keep driving for a little while. There was a thickening fog around my head, like alcohol or a dream, and I knew I would do it if only because I didn't want to take him to the police against his will and lose his trust forever. And I didn't want to take him home quite yet, and I didn't want to drop him in the middle of the road. It was only a few hours later that I realized I could have taken him back to the library and waited for Rocky. It was several days later that I remembered what was even more obvious. His address and phone number would have been in the computer file, right there below his name and above the $12 fine. But I couldn't think over the sound of his sobbing. Or maybe I couldn't think of anything but his sobbing. Or maybe on some level this is what I'd wanted all along, to get him out of Hannibal, if only for a few minutes. I just hadn't wished it so literally. Drive where? I asked. Somewhere, he said. My grandmother's house. I knew he didn't have a grandmother. Okay, I said. That's what I'll say.